So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How's everyone doing? So, we've only got about a week or so before the end of December, the new year, up and coming. And what can I say? It's been such an incredible year. We have already seen on LinkedIn so many numerous videos, talks, hashtags as to what 2020 actually encompassed. It's been a turbulent year, one that has challenged us all, needless to say, regardless of which sector that you're from and regardless of which position that you're in. And might I even add, the more senior of a position that you're in, the more stress probably entailed, be it with the workforce, be it because of supply chain issues. Yes, I'm talking about COVID-19. And today's topic is actually quite symbolic because I feel last year, which I'm talking about 2019, I remember family and friends coming to visit, and I remember how a different world we'd lived in. And in fact, I actually visited China, had some friends visiting. Even in November, there was no signs of COVID at all. And come December, January, February, and we got to see the full force of what was actually to come. So what I want to do today is actually talk, in essence, a summary of COVID-19 at the time that I wrote with my colleague J.U. For Fanda law firm, and what we saw in terms of force majeure in the UAE and also in China then. And then I want to move on to a market analysis, or in essence, what has been the trends during COVID and potentially what can we expect. Now, you might say, how is it, as a lawyer, that you're also talking about, in essence, is forecast? Well, guess what? I call myself a legal futurist, so welcome to my world. I would say that COVID-19 actually has brought the future forward because, let's just say, for us lawyers who have been traditionally very much bound to our way of doing things, well, guess what? Working from home, being agile and being tech, and I mean tech in the sense of, doing court cases online, finding resources more quickly, and also, of course, using Zoom and all the available online resources has just been second nature within a few months, and something that has been advocated for, for the last, a few decades has basically been, put on its head and spurred very quickly just over the last few months. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about force majeure. And this is an article that was originally written at the time when I was with Fisher & Co. With my colleague then. And also it was published with LexisNexis and then republished with amendments with the Inter-Pacific Bar Association Journal and also with the online publication, the Jurist. So obviously this article, the timing of it was very important because I would say it was one of the earlier articles written in the UAE. Pretty much come January, my colleagues were up and running in the sense of wanting to understand what the situation was. So let's talk about figures because I think it's representative and also gives you an idea. So as of date, we're talking about almost 77 million having contracted coronavirus. Of that, a bit less than half, 43 million have recovered. And what we've seen so far is I've got 1.7 million of people who've passed away. And if you talk about general trends, I was staying in the UAE, and I would say that the UAE was one of the first countries that kind of quickly figured out to contain this, we need to basically socially distance ourselves. And there were very strict lockdowns for a number of period of time. The way it went about was very smart because the UAE government would, in essence, announce we're going to have a 2-week lockdown, and then they would announce maybe we should extend that. So they had a very, I would say, hard, soft approach, but it kind of worked. People were compliant. And then you see around the world with Australia with the very hard lockdown, and now in Europe. And also in some places in America. So we are seeing trends, and we are seeing it's being evolved, as it were, over time. So I want to say at the time of writing this article, I have to say when I was working with the publishers, literally the figures, the situation was changing literally day by day. So it was very difficult actually to write this article article because, what I wrote would be redundant in essence the very next day because the figures would have changed and all that. But at the time of writing, we're talking, a few months in earlier, say back in February, we were looking at much more minimal figures. We were talking only 1.9. Can you imagine? So, from there and then in the UAE. So something about the UAE is they acted very quickly and they chose the World Trade Center, for example, in Dubai to basically host or to look after people. And currently right now we're talking of vaccines, which at the time, obviously, at the time of writing, I didn't actually write about. But let me start by talking about, so that's the overview, introduction of what's been happening. And I think the UAE has been very proactive and that I think a lot of countries are following suit. As we all know, right now, we're just awaiting for trials to come through, for volunteers, and to see what are the side effects of certain vaccines. So everything's still in the unknown, and I'm giving probably a good few months to 6 months to really see how things plan out. So let's talk about force majeure in the UAE. So the notion of force majeure in a common law sense is pretty much this idea of something that is beyond one's control, right? So in a lot of contracts, we usually think of force majeure in terms of, natural disasters, fires, earthquakes and whatnot. So it's a very good question to ask about force majeure, a natural disaster. At the time, we didn't even have a term for COVID-19. We just had a pandemic, we had a virus, we had a whatever you want to call it. Nobody actually knew how to even identify or define. So, what we've seen actually, as a comparator, we've seen in the UAE how we responded, the government saying, look, because we as a government are imposing businesses to close business for now, be it, restaurants, bars, that, the government even encouraged governments to pay, or reduce the rentals, for businesses. So it got to the point, I think, even, some businesses were, or landlords, in essence, were offering low rents. And I think even tenants have been requesting low rents. In places like Australia, they've made it more stringent. They've made it a more of a government requirement. Now, I think the jury is still out whether it's a good business decision or not, because the fact that, in terms of ratings, for example, Melbourne's been downgraded. I don't know whether economically speaking it's a sound thing. Obviously, you look at Sweden, and in fact, I think it was the king who recently said, they didn't do as well, which is a very frank and open, discussion, because they didn't enforce the use of masks at an earlier stage. So I think the jury is still out as to how we're assessing how governments and countries have performed, because it is a very challenging situation from the very get-go. But coming back to force majeure in the UAE, so under Article 267 of the federal law, this is number 5-1 1985, the civil transaction laws would state that it is a contract. So if a contract, is valid and binding, then none of the contracting parties may revoke, modify, or resign in exceptions by mutual consent order of the court or law. And the code enables the parties to cease the contract upon mutual consent. Now, however, a clause which must be drafted in line with the UAE law, and this is under Article 247 of the Civil Code, which states, in bilateral contracts where the reciprocal obligations are due, each of the contracting parties shall have the right to abstain from executing his obligations where the other party does not honor his obligations. Thank you. A party has the right to withhold performance of its contractual obligations in the event that the other party fails to perform its contractual obligations. So, in other words, if neither party is able to perform. So under Article 271 of the Civil Code, it states that the parties may agree that the case of non-performance, in essence, deriving from the contract, if it was deemed, in essence, without the need to obtain a court order. Now, we probably have figured out quite quickly that in the scenario of force majeure, it's not really an issue of whether the parties wish to consent. I think, everyone would have it that business would run as usual. It's more the scenario because of unforeseen circumstances when neither or none of the parties can actually do anything about it, that they have to, in essence, oblige, as it were, one or either of the parties. It's been a very concerning period of time because as a lawyer, I've seen businesses really struggle. I've seen businesses, particularly in the field, say in construction and shipping and supply chain, where they genuinely want to do business, but there is just no way, shape or form. We have seen shipments turn back at the very early stages from countries like Taiwan, Singapore, and moreover, delays in shipments has just been the norm. We will move on to seafarers, which is a topic very close to my heart, which we can talk about a bit more as well. But let's look at the law first. So alternatively, if we look at Article 273 of the Civil Code, it says that an event beyond the control of the parties is that unforeseeable and that renders the contract impossible to perform may excuse the parties from performance. And the article states that in bilateral contracts, it is force majeure arising in essence, which makes the performance or the obligation impossible. And then number two is if the impossibility is partial, the consideration for the impossible task shall be extinguished. Now, this is a continuous contract in both instances. The creditor may resign from the contract provided the debtor has knowledge thereof. So if we look at a situation like this, in COVID-19, where in essence, parties are not doing business. Let's say, you are a tour guide operator, you plan for the year for all these bus tours to come to Dubai and in essence to execute the contracts that you have. They're going to stay in hotels, they're going to eat in certain venues, and they're going to see certain shows. But what we've seen is because of a ban in travel, let's say we start with China, okay? Let's say because they banned the city of Wuhan, your tours, is not coming at all to Dubai, and hence you have to cancel everything. Now, in the first instance, we would say that it's been an impossible task. Clearly, even if you said we'll give them free tour, it's not possible because they're not allowed to leave their country. And then secondly, the impossibility of it, or be it that it's delayed. Well, what if we deferred it to 2021? So arguably, what you could say is rather than cancelling the contracts, you in essence say, look, we're going to defer all the tour tickets, including the F&Bs, including the hotels, including the shopping experiences and whatnot, and then you defer it to 2021. Now, for a lot of businesses, I would say that makes absolute common sense. I mean, why break and breach contract when you can, in essence, work better and improve on it? Now, currently, what we're seeing, we've already seen in some German courts, some being fought out in Australia, New Zealand, US, there is the fine line. You have a scenario where governments are imposing curfews. You have a scenario where, social distancing is actually a measure, a way to prevent social harm. So, for example, in restaurants, it was very clear there was going to only be a maximum of 4 people per seat or table. So for any booking, you're only limited to that. So you would need to only book, for example, a table of 4. And if you wanted more, you would have to book under certain names and certain criteria. There was certainly no social gathering. And I guess in light of Christmas coming up, it's very clear people don't even know, what are the rules. And I think in Australia, they've also relaxed it more recently as to who and how many people can gather. Now, under Article 287 of the Civil Code in the UAE, it says that in the absence of a provision in the law or of an agreement to the contrary, a person is not liable for reparation if he proves that the prejudice resulted from a cause beyond his control, because of unforeseeable circumstances, force majeure, or the fault of others, or that of the victim. So on that basis, you could even argue then quite clearly if force majeure is triggered, then no damages ought to be not to arise from that. But how is that satisfactory? It's a huge question mark. And let's look at force majeure from DIFC. So this is under Article 82.1 of the DIFC law, number 6-2004, and it states, except with exception, in respect to a mere obligation to pay, non-performance by a party is excused if that party proves that the non-performance was due to impediment beyond its control, and that it could not reasonably be expected to have taken the impediment into account at the time of the conclusion of the contract and avoided and overcome its consequences. On the face of it, if you read it like this, could any business have thought of COVID-19? Could any business thought of the extent to which COVID-19 impacted the world the way it did? I think the answer on a reasonable person's basis is absolutely not. I don't think anyone, even up till January, not even the Chinese themselves, would have figured out what was going on. Because remember, come January, flights were still ongoing. I mean, Christmas is usually the busiest time for the Western world, but Chinese New Year is the biggest event for many Chinese. And in fact, I knew a lot of my friends from Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo. They were traveling like crazy. So I would say nobody knew, I think, in February what consequence it would have had. And obviously, as things unfolded, we gradually discovered and found out and having to quickly adapt. Now, it says that a party may be exempt from performing its contractual obligation if it could prove that non-performance was due to circumstances beyond its control. So the key word here is beyond its control. So then if we flip the coin and we go, well, what was within your control? Very little. Sorry, I mean it in a very genuine sense. I think, this idea of, this catch-22, you had the WHO, not wishing to ban people from traveling, but yet we were all holding our breaths as to when they were going to announce this as a pandemic. And by the time that they did announce it, I think all countries were already acting in a flurry. All businesses, particularly in the food industry, the logistics, the supply chain, were trying to figure out what and where do we stand. Even employees, do we go to work? Do we not go to work? There were lots of questions, and I think a lot of answers needed. Demands from government, demands from individuals. Let's go a bit further and see what Article 82.2 of the DIFC number 6-224 says. It says, when the impediment is only temporary, the excuse shall have effect for such a period as it is reasonable, having regard to the effect of the impediment on performance of the contract. So this impediment, or this clause, in essence, governs temporary. Now, could you define COVID-19 as temporary? I mean, at this point in time, sitting here, let's just say I'm in a restaurant, so I'm eating as well. So I'm not necessarily wearing a face mask, but in the usual circumstance I would be. It doesn't feel very temporary. 3 weeks, 3 months. I'm not in any way hoping for this to extend, but let's say COVID-19 doesn't quite finish until mid of next year, end of next year. What and how do we define temporary? So Article 82.3 of DIFC law number 6-2004 states, the party who fails to form must give notice to the other party of the impediment, and it's the obligation of the affected by force majeure to notify the others. Now, at this point in time, I don't know if telling your supplier, look, I'm going to delay the shipment or I'm going to delay X, Y, and Z is going to be good enough. Because what they're going to do is they're going to look for other suppliers that are going to be able to give them what they want. Now, I have a real life case which I can share with you all, which is quite a shocking news, but it's true. So I knew of one startup, they were actually doing face masks, but they stopped production 6 months ago. And by the time they had picked up speed, they were hoping to export from China to the USA. And come by that time, the government was already very concerned about the volume of face masks. Production was clearly not high enough, that they actually blocked all exports. So can you imagine the situation he was in? He had orders from the US, he had investors that were expecting profits, and he was also doing shipments. But thank goodness he contacted me, because we started having a conversation and I just reminded him the world that we were currently in, which was a world which was not moving. Nothing was moving, no shipments, clearly delays, and the options he had was very limited. So I advised him, you were either going to tell your clients quite blatantly, they could either wait, take their money back, or go elsewhere. There was very little that actually, when you think about it, that he could have actually done, even if he had wanted to. So come again, let's have a look at Article 82.4. It says that nothing in this article prevents a party from exercising the right to terminate the contract or to withhold performance or request interest on money due. Now, this is a harsh approach, but I think this is where the fear comes in. Let's say if businesses start terminating contracts one by one, slowly by slowly, we will end up in a vicious cycle where, in a sense, there'll be no business, right? Now, in a scenario where you try and delay, contract terms, where you try to, in essence, ensure that business can still continue, we're looking at a delay instead. So, for example, I have some contacts, some friends and colleagues who work in the insolvency business, and we've already seen some companies, particularly in the restaurant business, in essence, filing or considering bankruptcy. But what my friend said to me is, he's also a fellow insolvency practitioner, is wait till next year, and wait till next year in the early first and second quarters, because this is where we're going to see the businesses turning over. It's a sad reality, and I think as someone who works with entrepreneurs and works with businesses, I would say, guys, let's think of a way to save businesses, not, send them to their graves, as it were, because it is such a harsh time and such a hard, difficult time right now for the whole world that I can't imagine, where will you start if you start with nothing or go backwards, So I tell all my friends who are running startups, colleagues who are running businesses, I say, if you're staying afloat in COVID-19 times, you're doing extremely well, right? You've got to turn it on its head and be positive. How about force majeure in ADGM? So the ADGM follows the English common law, and the guidance in the ADGM market is under Article 2.6.2D and F. It says a recognized body must have a business continually plan that is subject to periodic review and scenario testing, which addresses events posing a significant risk of disrupting operations, including events that could cause a widespread major disruption. So the plan here in D is contain appropriate emergency rules for force majeure events, and F outline business continuity procedures. Now, to be honest with you, this is easier said than done. As I said before, you could plan for a fire, you could plan for some sort of business disruption, but I think COVID-19 is totally unprecedented. And it's a tough one because it's a fine line between having a balancing act of running your business, ensuring that your clients are happy, but also watching your bottom line. So I think whilst it's all very good that the ADGM has a guide, I think it's great. And I think, in fact, post-COVID-19, businesses definitely need that for the sake of insurances and insurance claims. But I think even insurances are probably rethinking their business model, post-COVID-19 world. But I think we all have to, plan a little bit better. Certainly, by all means, in the supply chain business and even in fintech. The reason why I say I think the world of COVID-19 has brought the future forward is think of fintech. People don't want to touch cash. They don't want to exchange money. So now they're all going online, which ironically has meant, it's better for the, online payment world. How about looking at China? So the legal analysis of China, and this I credit to JU, as I said before, of our funder law firm. So in the PRC, the applicable laws in the mainland, and for the purposes of this article, the article which I'll share the link with you in due course, excludes Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan, in accordance with the laws legislated by the National People's Congress. And the rules of force majeure are mainly stipulated in three main laws. So firstly, there's the general rules of the civil law in 2017. Under Article 180, it provides that a person is unable to perform the civil obligation due to force majeure. The person shall not bear civil liability. If the law provides otherwise, such provision shall prevail. And of course, force majeure means unforeseeable, unavoidable, and insurmountable objective conditions. B is the General Principles of Civil Law 1987, amended in 2009. And Article 107 provides that civil liability shall not become a failure to perform contract or damages to a third party if it is caused by force majeure. except as otherwise provided by law. So under Article 153, for the purpose of law, force majeure means unforeseeable, unavailable, and insurmountable objective conditions. So pretty much like the first one. And then number 3 is contract law and 1999. So Article 94 provides that either of the parties may terminate the contract under any of the specified circumstances, one of which is where the aim of the contract cannot be attained because of force majeure. Now, under Article 117, the contract cannot be fulfilled due to force majeure. It may be exempted in whole or in part on the impact of the force majeure. So unless the laws provide otherwise. Now, it is a pretty tough one because on the one hand, the laws are pretty much as I read it, you will not be liable if you cannot perform because of force majeure. But if that is the case, then a lot of businesses are literally going to go downhill. A lot of the contracts are going to be, in essence, well, I say breach, but in essence, non-deliverable. So in summary, force majeure is an objectively seen scenario, and COVID-19 is one of them. Now, let's say for a moment, we look at January, February. Come March, April, May, June, and even up to now, could you still argue that point? I would say if we give the businesses a benefit of the doubt, particularly once we knew that COVID-19 was a pandemic, once we knew that certain measures like social distancing, wearing of gloves and masks and using hand sanitizers, whatever business you might be in, then you would have had at least some knowledge. Unless you were hiding somewhere in this world, you would have had some knowledge that COVID-19 was in existence. And therefore, maybe you couldn't plead ignorance to the same extent that you could have. If you get what I'm trying to say, is you maybe at the initial point in time in December, January, February, even March and April, you couldn't say, you could say force majeure, and therefore I cannot do anything. But maybe in the latter months, it could be arguable that given there was some time to adapt, even say Christmas now, that businesses would have adapted and amended themselves in a way or accommodated the business situation to make the business viable. I know it's not a very sound argument because I've spoken to a number of businesses and they say, look, Helen, it's not that easy to change processes. It's like if you make shipments of orders, if you've made orders for certain containers, you're not going to suddenly, within months, change your business model because this is all budgeted for. But in a scenario where you can imagine, and I think maybe this is a good time to talk about the shipping sector because it has been hit so badly. The issue of seafarers is one that's very close to my heart because some of you may know I embarked on starting a PhD on maritime security, and I really appreciate the seafarers as people who, in essence, deliver the goods and services eventually for our use, our being. And I think we've felt the crunch even more when we've discovered that, a lot of countries at the beginning were rejecting shipments into their shores. And in doing so, it gave the impression that maybe people were going to run out of supplies, toilet paper, fresh food, other necessities in life, So I think post-COVID-19, I think we're really going to have to figure out who are, and really give credit to the heroes to keep the global ecosystem working, not just what's been shown or written of in the media, but actually the hidden players who are really keeping the world economy running. So at the time, back in February, there was very little case law, although it was anticipated. And of course, right now we can quite clearly see, and of course, come 2021, we're most likely to see more definitive case law coming out. I think one of the challenges the judges and in terms of what kind of perspectives are is, a lot of the judges are probably going to be reluctant to even trigger force majeure, only because it does open the floodgates to a certain extent, but it is clearly unavoidable. I think for businesses who are able to mediate and able to talk things through, as it were, in terms of terms and conditions, revising, having an annex in their terms and conditions, in terms of supply chain, in terms of deliverables, they will probably fare better. And in fact, if such delay could be, of course, covered by insurance or covered by either party or both parties, then I think there would be a happy ending to what could have been a totally disastrous COVID-19 2020. I'm always of the view that mediation is a better way of doing things than to litigate, although litigation is obviously unavoidable in certain circumstances. I think COVID-19 definitely calls for greater mediation and greater understanding from businesses. Some businesses, I've done some cases, including arbitration, that involves COVID-19, and it requires a total reasonable test. Everyone's affected by COVID-19 in a different way. Some would survive, some may not. In the same way that some businesses are thriving, and I'm thinking specifically of the likes of Deliveroo, of the cleaning. In fact, I have one friend actually, they know of a contact. It's a household name in Hungary, and it's been a household name for generations. Yet they've never made it rich. And come COVID-19, they've just done brilliantly. And then you've got some businesses that are doing poorly. And so, it's a very mixed time for a lot of businesses. And so as an advisor, as a mentor for startups, I would say, as entrepreneurs, we always say that if there's a challenge, there's an opportunity. If your business needs to pivot, why not? Okay, so in terms of performance and impact, so I would say that there are some case laws that have already come out, referring back to, in this case in China. There was one case called Huangping County Middle School versus Kunsha Xinhuo Enterprise Management, where the court held that the school had failed to submit evidence regarding whether the local disease control and prevention authority had issued a suspension suggestion to the school. Thus, the court did not uphold the argument that the school should be exempt from breach due to force majeure. And another case called Huaken International Trading Co. and Shanxi Luadu Meat Industry, it was held by the court there was no specific traffic blocks or trade restrictions during the period of SARS. Thus, SARS was not a force majeure event that impeded the performance of the delivery obligation. So we can see from these cases that the party under impact must submit evidence which basically provided for an impediment. So what about the scope of travel? So there was a case, Travel USA versus Changjiang Ship Overseas Travel Corporation, which referred to JP Travel and Changjiang Corporation, where JPI Travel chartered a cruise ship from Changjiang Corporation to operate a travel business in the area of the Three Gorges. Shipping was suspended for several months due to the impact of SARS, and JPI Travel claimed to terminate the rental contract. The court held that the suspension period only accounted for 47.5% of the average lease term of the ships, and so the scope of the impact was not enough to make the purpose of the contract impossible. Thus, JPI Travel was not entitled to terminate the contract. So let's give a live example of what was happening actually during COVID. We saw a number of cruise ships starting in Yokohama and then in America and then a number of other countries where we, in essence, had passengers trapped amongst the ships. What we knew of was, as the coronavirus was developing, that the increasing numbers of passengers also had numbers increase. In that kind of a scenario, how did cruise ship respond? I think a lot of them gave their money back actually at the very beginning because it was a scenario that was totally unintended for. Can you imagine? You buy a cruise ship for the chance of a lifetime to see the world, to enjoy, and then suddenly you're locked indoors for weeks on end and in fear. So I think rather than having a trip of a lifetime, let's just say it was not one. And that I think the cruise ship did what was, I think, really respectable as a business to do that. Because, I cannot imagine how those people would have imagined. Come 6 months, now almost 9 months down the line, I'm not sure for a start, A, whether cruise ships would have the same volume, probably not. B, whether they would travel the kind of distance, probably not. And whether they would compensate in the same way, probably not. Because in a lot of if we look at the airline travel as a good example, when the PBC tests came out, it was mandatory for those tests to be done. It was somewhat ad hoc. It wasn't consistent, to say the least. You could get a test from your GP, or you could have gone to centres which were open up in shopping malls, or you could have done the blood prick test. But in any event, it took a while to get the test done. And even then, you had to comply with countries within your country. So say in the UAE, and then you had to go to the US or Europe or whatnot. So you had to comply to 2 countries' laws. The Emirates, for instance, have decided what we'll do is we'll cover all that. So whether they stomach the cost or whether that is added on, I think that's a brilliant idea. And they also include insurance. So in the event a passenger goes on board, having done the test and catches coronavirus, they would pay for the insurance. And I think that is a brilliant idea because it's about managing risk. And I think as an airline, above all else, it's not just about the individual, it's also about how their company and businesses are doing. And of course, the airline as a business have been one of the most felt and hit industries, which currently is going through a downturn, and it may take them a while to recover. And in fact, there has already been a lot of adverts for people to reconsider their career options. It's a tough call, it's a tough period, particularly for those that have trained all their lives to be an air flight pilot, but in the current market, it just isn't the place to be. So what can we say? It's a time of change, and we all have to just adapt. So what has been the government policy in relation to coronavirus in China? So as we all know, the Chinese government and also the local government, particularly in Wuhan, had a very stringent and tough approach. They, in essence, locked down. And for better or worse, people were very compliant. And I think it's the same tone in the UAE, and hence the figures have reflected that, the positive side. And I think Melbourne has also done very well. New Zealand has also done very well. And of course, we saw some figures come back. And then now, at the time of speaking, we're talking about second and third waves from South Korea, some from Japan, and, also from the UK, where they're talking about a new strain of the coronavirus. So it's a tough time, and the WHO, I believe, are doing all that they could. But, from an intergovernmental, international, organizational level, there is very little in terms of, they can do only so much, let's put it this way. At the end of the day, it's what we do on the ground. And I guess when we match that with the WHO and advice, it's trying to pull through the situation as fast as possible. So in terms of the UAE and what the government done, I would say they've done extremely well. They issued statements from the very get-go. The mainstream newspapers here have also acted very quickly, advised accordingly. In fact, I recall the period where we even had to get licenses just to go and do our shopping. But generally, I think people have done very well. In terms of impact on businesses, no doubt, there has been clear impact on businesses. I think this idea of working from home is a universal phenomenon now. I think in the past where it was frowned upon, right now, at least in the previous workplace I was in, if you feel unwell, just stay at home, don't come to work. You don't need a doctor's note, obviously, but after a few days, if you persist, then do the test and make sure it's all okay. But it really has impinged, and in fact, a lot of finances, a lot of companies have also downsized. I mentioned the shipping sector earlier. I think in a very strange way, I don't know what it is. Did we assume the world was going to continue as it did? There are so many different theories as to why coronavirus happened, how it happened. If we are a positivist, I would say that, coronavirus has made us appreciate the things that we do have as opposed to the things we don't have. When families were stuck at home, lawyers, teachers, directors, whoever, and particularly some of my friends who used to say, I never had time for my kids. Now they had a lot of time with their kids and they didn't know what to do with it. But the idea of being quarantined is, I think, an experience to be had, and something, which is not the topic for this subject, but which I may do a webinar of, is how it has impacted people's mental health. In fact, just to give you an insight, during lockdown, one of the first things I did was to join an NGO and to work on a project looking at specifically mental health and specifically at seafarers, because there's a lot of discussions to be had that actually maybe at the end of the day, it's not coronavirus that's going to kill us. It's everything else but coronavirus. It's the stress. It's the frontliners, those that are working as doctors, nurses, working as, cashiers and all that. So I think the impact of coronavirus, not just purely on a financial level, but on a social level. So societal level is going to be felt more acutely over next year as well, because then we're going to see, if we're not already seen, what kind of support needs to happen, not just from a governmental, but from grassroots level. So let's talk about industries, because markets is also one of the things I wanted to explore. So we talked about the airline industry, and no doubt they are suffering. There's a lot of probably refinancing, possibly M&A, if not already happening. The automobile sector, we saw the price of oil go down like crazy. In fact, what we saw was a lot of people, chartering ships, basically get the oil first and then figure out how to use it. But clearly, we haven't seen streets as empty as it had before. People were telling me from India, it is an incredible sight in Bangalore, in Mumbai, in Delhi, to not see a single vehicle driving around the road is just unheard of. But I think for these sectors, I think it's hand in hand, actually, the fact that people don't want to travel as much, they can't travel as much. People are doing more stay vacations, and they basically want to stay safe. So going into places, traveling far and away, where you're not close to where your comfort zone is quite tough, actually. Restaurants, as I said before, it's a tough time. In fact, it's mainly governments who have been imposing social distancing and closing of restaurants. But the smarter ones who picked up on this have actually gone online and doing takeaways, and they are doing brilliantly. They're absolutely doing fantastic. And I believe at the time when I was doing this article, I recall the likes of Deliveroo went up by 400% profits. So not everyone's complaining, for sure. Technology firms, the likes of Zoom, the likes of Meetup, internet, I'm saying, for any budding entrepreneur, now is the time to probably get online and start your online business, because I think this is where the boom is going to be. It's no longer going to be the traditional go out there, shop and find. It's literally at your fingertips. What do you want? Of course, bearing in mind delays, but nevertheless, it's not going to change people's mindset of wanting to look for things, looking to find things. And hence, I guess this also explains why I'm doing all of this online myself. Restricted travel. I remember telling my mum, the world is so big, tell me where you want to travel and whatnot. And then when coronavirus hit, I was like, even if they give you a free ticket around the world, don't even think about it. So I think as human beings, we've adapted very quickly. I think this idea of restricted travel is very real. And even to date, the idea that, if you travel to another country and to be quarantined 14 days, in essence, your holiday is stuck in a hotel room. And then from there, you've got all the hassle of having to, deal with all the authorities, jumping back on a plane. I think a lot of people just don't like the idea of it. And so even for me, this is something I think is going to change the way that we travel, as I said before. But then, okay, let's move on to trends. I think this is probably a more interesting and exciting period. So what have we discovered in 2020? So 2020 has basically turned the world on its head, as we've known. Whatever plans you had, as grand, as amazing, as wonderful as it could have been, let's just say it didn't happen. Having said that, I think it's really, as I said before, in a positive way, we've brought the future forward, we've brought technology on board, and I really feel this is a wonderful time for those that are either a startup or an investor to look into online businesses, to look at e-gaming, to look at businesses online. And I think it's going to be an amazing market. And ironically, believe it or not, I think there's a greater opportunity for growth, believe it. Because I have seen, a good example is the conferencing world. It's really hit the conferencing world because you can't gather thousands of people in one room or be at one venue. But those that were technology prepared, they were able to run their conferences. I'm part of a great law organization, and the conference has already been delayed twice. And I'm thinking to myself, if it delays again, this is not a good sign. So what I would say is, for all those that are running their businesses, if you think above the curve for 2021, get yourself, I guess, double wrap insurance. Think of what technologies you can adopt, and maybe in the other future webinars, I can try and share what latest technologies are out there as well for you, and particularly if you're legal advisors or lawyers and whatnot. Really Forecasting is, I think, going to be like the new norm as well. I don't think we can ever say anything with certainty, particularly in light of COVID-19. If you want a sort of Chinese, if you don't mind me putting a sort of metaphysics point of view on it, well, it would 2021 is probably going to be a similar, not status quo. There will be slight improvements, but it's still going to be a tough year. But for those that can really figure out how to make money and make the most of it, they will do well. So guess what? Like there's always a silver lining. And then it's a question of how open we are to these changes and how quick we are to adapt and how much we are willing to ask for help. A lot of businesses that are struggling, and one of the first webinars I did was actually on bankruptcy, not because I wanted businesses to go down that line, but because I wanted to give people heads up what they need to think about if they don't think their businesses are doing well, and what they can do to probably avoid bankruptcy, to be honest with you. So what I would say is, if you're in doubt, go and talk to a lawyer. If you are a lawyer yourself, offer value to your clients, give them great sound advice on how they can arrange things. And the other trend probably coming up is business structures. A lot of businesses may need to merge. A lot of businesses that wind up may have assets that could be sold. In fact, I worked on one of the few cases, first cases under the new bankruptcy laws in the UAE, where you have a head office outside of the UAE, 2 subsidiaries. It can get very complicated. Last but not least is timing. Timing is of the essence. If you think this was going to come and go quick, then you obviously, have not really been put your head to the ground in terms of what's going on. I would say plan well, and then obviously have backup plans. I think that's the best way. And of course, resource pooling. I think a lot of businesses have become very entrepreneurial, even gone back to the barter system. What can I offer you? What can you offer me? What can we do? And I think this takes the real test in terms of how sound a business one is. And you can see it. Once the restaurants start opening their doors, restaurants were opening with great deals, trying to encourage people to come out and eat. You're seeing businesses really trying to offer in hand, and really it's for if anything, another trend is the medical field is just going to be absolutely out of the roof, only because people have discovered what is the purpose of meaning or of living if they don't have their life for a start, or their health. So you have seen the healthcare sector, not just from a seriously medical treatment point of view, but from the idea of dieting, of eating well, getting rest, sleeping. And what's been interesting during COVID is you have some people gaining weight, some people losing weight. And I guess it says a lot about the individual and what aspirations they're looking for. So I think, to wrap up, COVID-19 has been a tremendous year of change. But I think 2021 is going to be also the same. In my Telegram talks, which I will also share below if you're interested to join, I have my startup called Space 2060, which is also the production for this talk for your CLPD points for the LAD in the UAE, is how do we make 2021 the comeback year? And if you follow me on Telegram, I have been doing a 30-day challenge talking about energies of the day, giving tips and advice to businesses, to individuals, particularly to entrepreneurs, because of the early stages that they're at, on how to make the most and how to make greater decisions. Particularly now in COVID-19, when we used to say time is money, I believe that's an old saying now. Right now, it's about how do we make better decisions, particularly when, whether you turn left or right, whether you stay put or go, is going to have such wide-ranging ramifications, not just for your business, for your health, for the well-being of, even your family and friends, and of course for your business. So to wrap things up, I would say, it's been a tough year, but good on you all for pulling through. I would say, if you're in doubt, talk to your legal advisor. If you're a legal advisor, really try and understand where your clients are coming from, and also give them as much sound advice as possible, because we all need it, particularly in 2021. With that, I want to mention the 21st of December, which is today. Today is actually a great day to manifest and For those that don't know, as a plug-in, it's where Saturn and Jupiter is actually at its closest near Earth. And so for those that are lucky in Latin America, they're most likely to be able to see the planets via telescope. And so for all of us, why not take this opportunity to manifest? Why not take this opportunity to think through how COVID-19 has impacted on us, what lessons we've learned, how has it shaped our industry, how has it impacted us, and then how do we want to change to make 2021 the best year ever. So to just give you a heads up of what I'm doing as part of New Space 2020. So there's a few more days. Some of you may already be following me. I'm also doing a number of CLPD events leading up to Christmas for a start. I already mentioned my Telegram, which I'm sharing with my members. And I'm doing a weekly podcast with Anchor, which is also shared amongst Spotify and other podcasts. So you're more than welcome to join. And I'm going to do ideally monthly CLPD points, which hopefully I'm going to apply to other common law jurisdictions like Australia, New Zealand, UK, America, Canada, and so forth. And so I will definitely keep you posted, and I would definitely invite you to join me as part of these discussions. I value your feedback, your input, your ideas, because this is only possible with your help and your support. And so one of the more final plugins is next year is the year of the ox. And for those that don't know, it is actually a great year to generate wealth. And so if you're with me, I've given you an overview of the laws of the UAE, of China, of the current market. I'm inviting you all to focus not on what you don't have control over, but rather what you do have control over. So in your own way, I invite you to brainstorm what is your wish list, what is your bucket list of things that you want to achieve for 2021. Do some meditation, seek sound legal advice, talk to people, and in the next few days leading up to Christmas, why wait till the new year? Take action. Actually go out there, make those phone calls, book in your diary, who you want to see, what you want to do, what do you need to book in to diarize those events and to make it happen. Because I think COVID-19 has been such a year where if we don't do anything, actually life changes anyway. So it's not the conventional saying, which is if you don't do anything, nothing changes. It's actually, if you don't do anything, it will just change really, truly beyond your control. So it's a self-imposed force majeure, I guess. But if you take the conscious decision to take action, then I would definitely think that you have a little more than what you don't have. So just a final sort of inspiring thought. About 2 years ago, I attended the United Nations Office of Outer Space, and I listened to an amazing American astronaut who spent one whole year out in space. You're going to ask me, what does space and COVID-19 have to do with it? Well, self-confinement and staying sane at the same time. And he spoke about, there were a few things that he learned about staying up in space for a year plus. And first thing was a different perspective. For example, in space, because of gravity, you have a different view of the world in terms of what you can hold and grasp. And when he came back to Earth, he had to learn everything from scratch. Like a child, he couldn't grasp things like he used to. He couldn't sense things like he used to. Even things tasted differently. His skin was very sensitive. And it was a very trying period in his life because he went up to space as one of the strongest, Vision 2020 kind of person. But coming back, he became very vulnerable and he had to relearn everything, how to walk properly, how his skin feels, the taste buds and everything like that. The second thing he mentioned was about life. And he said, during that time when he was up in space, one thing he had to teach himself was also to focus on the things that he could control, not on the things he could not control. And I think that is the greatest takeaway that we can take from COVID-19. And for all of my friends and colleagues out here is, why don't we thank the universe, thank whoever, the higher powers, for allowing us to pull through COVID-19, as I said before. To all the businesses surviving, I am actually congratulating you because you survived. and to think of all the things that we can do within our powers, and to continue and do more in 2021. There is nothing to say about failure or about things not turning out the way we want. The least we can do is just be grateful for what's been happening to us, and to count our blessings, because you never know. I think this is the thing. COVID-19 doesn't judge. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter whether you're the healthiest person or not, because I've had friends who are daily gym goers who still contracted and hospitalized. So I really send all my regards to all of you guys, particularly those that are in the front line, even to my lawyer friends who are working very hard to advise your clients, that we also exercise some compassion, be it working from home, be it running your court cases, whatever it might be, because it is a very trying time. And for me, my wish for 2021 in terms of for businesses is to be tough, stay strong, to keep doing the amazing things you're doing, because as long as you're surviving, and if every business thinks like that, surviving, you will thrive. And when you're thriving, you can keep the ecosystem going. I'm not just talking about the financial ecosystem. I am talking about the social ecosystem, the life support, and the livelihood that everyone is encountering. So without further ado, I want to thank you very much. If you like what you hear, please like and share. If you've got any comments and feedback, I welcome you. And please keep your eyes and ears posted. Thank you. This is created by New Space 2060, my startup, and I welcome you to follow, and you will see more of me during the year, where I will hold weekly podcasts, monthly CLPD events, and of course updates on energies of the day, particularly ones that are good, and also any recent news that I can share with you that is of value to you. So without further ado, I thank you for your time. I thank you for listening to my talks, my podcasts, and I wish you a wonderful, safe day and a great Christmas, Merry Christmas, and a wonderful 2021. Thank you.